Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Dread Templar. This is a retro throwback first-person shooter developed by T19 Games and published by Fulcrum Publishing, and it was released out of early access in January of this year. Now, I took a look at this game a while back as part of Steam Next Fest. It was one of the demos that was available, and I decided to give it a try, and it seemed like a pretty solid retro throwback shooter at the time, although it was a bit rough around the edges. How is it now that it's out of early access and has its full release? Well, let me put it this way. There's a reason this is an MTO rather than a full review. Obviously, I didn't finish this game. I made it about halfway through. I made it to E3 M1, and I just lost interest in continuing any further because I really wasn't having all that much fun up to that point, and I felt like I was just forcing myself to continue just for the sake of getting a video done. How would that end up happening in a game where, according to what you can see on the screen right now, it seems like it would be a really great retro throwback shooter with a lot of fast-paced action and some nice meaty gunplay? Well, the first problem is that while the level design is certainly very heavily inspired by retro first-person shooters with lots of secret areas to find, many of which are very well hidden, so you will be spending quite a lot of time finding them, and even some super secrets as they refer to them, where you have to go through some extra hoops to actually be able to get to that secret and get some really cool stuff. Unfortunately, they've dampened the coolness of the level design by putting in a save system that is not a save anywhere setup. Instead, there are checkpoints scattered throughout the levels where it will autosave, and if you want to actually save your game manually, you have to find a save point somewhere in the levels. Next problem is that while the baseline gunplay seems cool, but with the weapons having fairly solid sounds that do have some punch behind them, and the enemies often exploding into meaty chunks if you deal enough damage to them, unfortunately, you quickly find that the core gameplay loop mostly involves walking backwards and shooting at things as they simply charge you directly, because most of the enemies are really dumb and will just run up to you for melee attacks and not really anything else, and the ones that do hang back are easily dispatched with things like headshots from the revolver or from the bow, and the main way they've tried to compensate for the lack of threatening enemies is by just throwing a lot of them at you and having a lot of them be very spongy when it comes to the amount of damage you have to do to them. This means that the combat fairly quickly becomes tedious, and it only becomes even more tedious when boss fights are involved, because they're just massive bullet sponges that really just try your patience more than anything else, because all they really require to beat is not any grand strategy, not any clever tricks, just a ridiculous amount of ammo, and chances are you're probably going to run close to dry on ammo by fighting any of the bosses in this game at any point. All the while taking relatively minimal damage for the most part, because most of those enemies don't really have much that can actually hit you as long as you don't stop moving anyway, apart from some area effect attacks that might get in your way every so often. This ultimately means that while the combat system appears to be interesting and fun like a lot of other retro shooters, unfortunately, it just ends up being fairly tedious for the most part. And it certainly doesn't help that they've bolted on a, frankly, quite unwelcome upgrade system where you have various slots that you can unlock by spending these blood crystals, and after you've spent the crystals to unlock them, then you can slot various runes, as the game calls them, that will give you some passive bonuses, things like a bit of extra damage or extra ammo, neither of which are actually quantified when you look at the descriptions of those runes. Just more ammo, more damage, faster fire rate. Okay, what exactly does that mean? Can you give me some kind of quantifiable value so I can understand how important this upgrade is compared to, say, a different upgrade? Nope, can't be bothered? Okay, fine, then I'm not really gonna care all that much about the upgrade system. I still certainly used it, but I really didn't notice that much of a difference other than just getting extra ammo actually did help me out in the long run because, well, bullet sponges. And unfortunately, despite the levels having a lot of secrets where you can find a whole bunch of these runes and sometimes you can get access to weapons early and such, unfortunately, I never really felt all that much desire to go secret hunting outside of things that were relatively obvious, or occasionally the super secrets, because at least those had you doing some slight puzzle solving as part of them, so it was just a bit of variety there. But it certainly never felt like I was actually being rewarded all that much for doing secret hunting, because most of what you found was just a bit of ammo, maybe some armor or some health pickups, and that was pretty much it for the most part. They did try to throw in a bit of variety with the side areas, where it's supposed to be an area where you face a more difficult challenge than the rest of the level, but more often than not I found that the so-called challenges in these side areas were really no different from the levels themselves, or if they were usually a bit easier. And much like with the other secret areas, their rewards really weren't all that worth going into those side areas either. So that means that while the level design itself is mostly solid for a retro throwback shooter, you don't really feel like there's all that much incentive to actually go and explore and find all those secrets and such. You just feel like you want to go through as quickly as possible just to get it over with. Because most of the time, you're just fighting enemies that really aren't all that interesting or even really all that threatening, with weapons that also really aren't all that interesting, especially given that their effect on target is limited by the enemy's health pools, all the while a fairly mediocre metal soundtrack plays in the background, which is certainly not bad, but it very quickly becomes repetitive, especially when they start repeating tracks even as early as E1. And none of this is helped by the fact that not only does this game wear its influences on its sleeve, it basically shoves them in your face constantly. And here's the thing that a lot of developers don't seem to understand about this. By constantly throwing this kind of stuff in your face, where you'll just wander into an area and be like, oh, this is literally just an area from Quake, or oh, this is literally just an area from Blood, you end up having to compare it to those classic games, which ends up being a serious problem when your game does not compare favorably to those games. You see, the problem with Dread Templar isn't so much that it's a bad game, because it's not. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. The problem is that it has a lot of issues that add up to it being a mediocre at best one. That wouldn't have been as much of a problem a few years ago when retro throwback shooters really weren't much of a thing at all, but retro-styled first-person shooters have seen a resurgence of late, and we're basically spoiled for choice at the moment. We've got a lot of really good games out there now, and something like Dread Templar, which is just okay at absolute best, really doesn't cut it anymore. I'm certainly not saying that there is absolutely no chance in hell you'll ever enjoy Dread Templar. I'm just saying that there are so many better options out there right now that there's just not much of a reason to play Dread Templar unless you've already played through all of those other games and just want another retro throwback shooter to tide you over until, say, I don't know, Prot comes out next week, or Warhammer 40k Bolt Gun comes out later this month, or whenever the next episode of Cultic drops. So if that's the situation you find yourself in, then maybe Dread Templar will fit the bill for you. It's about 5 or 6 hours long depending on how much secret hunting you do and what difficulty you're playing on, but I'd still recommend only getting it if it's on sale for a decent price, because as it stands, $20 feels a bit much for it given how ultimately mediocre the game is overall. But if you're not somebody who's already played through all the better retro throwback shooters but still needs your fix, well, just go with one of the other retro throwback shooters that's a hell of a lot better than this. Thank you all very much for watching. Unfortunately, Dread Templar was rather disappointing, but hopefully the next game I'll be taking a look at doesn't end up being disappointing. Guess we'll just have to wait and see on that. Anyway, thanks again for watching. If you like the channel, please consider supporting it on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.